I have the privilege and good fortune to talk with my colleague and friend Bob Mary, who is stepping down as editor of the National Interest after several years and moving out to Washington State to focus on writing books, and he'll become political editor of the National Interest, writing both on foreign policy and on domestic issues. Bob, you've been in Washington for 4 decades. What has changed the most in the city since you first arrived?
Well, Jacob, let me say first of all that note to our audience that you will be my successor, and I'm very, very pleased about that. And I think we're going to have a tremendous continuity here between my 2-year tenure at the National Interest and your ongoing tenure. So congratulations to you. Everyone talks about how Washington has become more rancorous and difficult and impossible and polarized, and that's all true. But Washington reflects the country at large. And I have to say that in my 40 years here, I haven't seen the country at large be quite so beset by an identity crisis that it has today. The country is struggling with major questions that are identity questions. Immigration is an identity question. What kind of a country are we going to be? Taxation is an identity question. What kind of a country are we going to be in terms of who's going to get taxed and where is that going to come from? Certainly the role of government is a huge identity crisis or identity question, at least a crisis at various times in our history. And I think it has now. And so I think that while all of this polarization in Washington is correct, it's also a reflection of the country at large, and that's a significant development that is bearing down on all of us, really.
Bob, I'd like to go back into history, since you write a lot about history. We've had previous eras of great contention in American politics. We had the era preceding the Civil War. We had the North-South divide. Then we had tremendous acrimony in the mid to late 1930s over the issue of whether or not America should enter World War II, which Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said eclipsed any dispute that he had experienced during his lifetime, including the Vietnam War and the McCarthy era. So what do you feel distinguishes this era from the past?
Well, I'm not sure that it's distinguished that much from these other eras that we're talking about, but if you're talking about the 1850s, beginning in 1849, when the House couldn't elect a speaker, because the country was so divided on slavery and the new territories that James Polk had brought into the country. If you go back to the War of 1812, preceding the War of 1812, and the geographical divide of the country at that point, even if you go back to the very early decades, the first couple of decades of our history, in which the country was trying to determine what kind of a country it was going to be, politics was very intense during those times, as well as the times that you mentioned. We're in one of those times, and we've had maybe in our history 5 or 6 of those times. So it's not like the country was founded on this kind of polarity and anxiety and tension and nastiness in its political manifestations. But we're there now, and it is very much reminiscent of these other times in our history.
What do you think it would take to break the deadlock today?
Crises in America, in our political system, which is quite distinct from most others, are solved by presidential leadership or not at all. And so I believe that eventually, and I don't know when that might happen, a president will emerge who is able to create new foundations for America to go forward. A lot of people think if you just sort of bring these two sides together and sort of come to some kind of a middle ground and everything will be fine. That's not how democratic politics works, and that's not how this crisis is going to be solved. It's going to be solved by a president who's going to be able to sort of transform the political landscape and scramble up the fault lines of America and politics in such a way as to create new coalitions that we haven't thought of before. It's always attended with big disruption, but ultimately it breaks the logjam and allows the country to move forward. And the presidents who have done that. Roosevelt was one. Lincoln famously did that. When Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," it was electric, because all the politicians of that time were trying to prop up a divided House that couldn't stand. And he, in saying that, shook up the politics of America in such a way that allowed for a new coalition to emerge, and it became a very, very powerful coalition, the Republican Party, which dominated the whole second half of the 19th century and well into the 20th. So that's what's going to take, and when that might happen, I don't know. I don't think that Obama is the president to do that. He had a chance, he had an opportunity to do that, and I think he muffed it. Whether that'll happen in the next election, no one can tell.
Can you tell me, I'd be interested in your analysis of the current state of the Republican Party as far as this crisis is concerned that you're describing. Where do you see the Republican Party headed? And it's currently divided between several wings, though obviously the more conservative wing appears to have the upper hand, and there's a more hawkish bent on policy and a very conservative wing with the Tea Party as well. A lot of people talk about the Republican Party itself being a house divided. What's your analysis?
A lot of people believe that the Republican Party is basically on its last legs, and of course they've said that about the Republican Party many times in the past, and they've said it at various times, not as often, about the Democratic Party. But it's possible that the Republican Party will founder in such a way as not being able to get its act together and will ultimately decline, and there'll be a realignment and some new emergence. I don't really think that's going to happen. I think the future of the country is probably written in the two current parties, but not necessarily. But in part, my answer reflects my previous answer to your previous question, because ultimately, in our politics, it's going to be a president, not a political institution, not a political party, that is going to transform American politics. And if the Republican Party can bring forward the president who can do that, then it will find its way to success. If it can't, it won't. If the Democratic Party can do that, then the Democratic Party will have that edge. But in any event, it's got to be done by the president.
You said that President Obama muffed it. I'd be curious as to how and why you believe that occurred.
I believe that President Obama had a remarkable political opportunity when he was elected in 2008. The country was hungry for somebody who could find a new way, and who better than an African-American Democratic president who could move the Democratic Party away from its old moorings, which were long since outdated, and craft what I'm talking about, which is a new way of looking at politics, transforming the political landscape, scrambling up the fault lines and creating new coalitions. But he didn't do that, and I think the real key was when, on the stimulus package, he essentially sent it up to the House Democrats and let Nancy Pelosi and her very good pals up there, who were all tied to the old Democratic politics, essentially craft a bill that wasn't a stimulus at all, with just a collection of old, tired programs that had been thwarted for decades, really. And he signaled that that wasn't what he was going to do, and I think the American people promptly lost interest in him as that kind of a leader, and he's never been able to really recapture his position.
You were a longtime correspondent and reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and I know you've talked to me about some of your travels, including with George Herbert Walker Bush. As you look back, who was the most impressive president that you believe you saw in action in these past decades?
I came to Washington in 1974. The day I resigned my job at the Denver Post to come to Washington was the same day that Richard Nixon resigned his job as President of the United States. They're not comparable at all, but what it signifies is that I came to Washington just as he was leaving. I got to know him a little bit thereafter when he was trying to rehabilitate himself, and I had emerged as a reporter with a byline of some note, I guess. So from Nixon on to our current time, I would have to say that the president, most impressive president during that period, by any standard, would be Ronald Reagan, who did in fact altered the political landscape, who did create new coalitions. Who would have thought when we were talking about the Republican Party in 1965, after the Goldwater debacle, much as we're talking about the Republican Party today, that in 16 years, the Republican would emerge, not least a former actor, about whom they would say, and who would be the most conservative Republican president probably of the century, about whom they would say he created a whole contingent of, quote, Reagan Democrats. He could have predicted such a thing, and yet he did. And that's the kind of thing that presidents who are consequential do when they become president. They create new coalitions.
When we look at foreign policy today, how do you assess the future of realist thought? That is, people who tend to be more cautious about intervention abroad, as we saw. This is a tradition that goes back to Elihu Root, Henry Stimson, Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, James Baker, Bob Zellick, of moderate Republicans who believe in the exercise of force, but only in a prudent manner and when deemed absolutely necessary. The very opposite of the neoconservative crusading approach, which is an amalgam of nationalism and Wilsonianism. How do you feel about the future of that tradition in the Republican Party?
Jacob, the magazine that, our magazine, the one that I've edited and the one that you're going to edit, is a realist magazine. That's our stock in trade. That's what we believe in. And I would love to be able to say that the state of realism in foreign policy is soaring and it's just thriving, but it's not. And what strikes me about what's going on in Congress particularly, but within discourse generally, is how little the realist point of view is really represented in discourse of members of Congress. Not that they may not have some impulses there, but they're just not expressing it or finding ways to bring life to the concept verbally. And it's sort of a disturbing reality. But we'll chip away at it and view ourselves a little bit like William Buckley's crew in 1955 when they created National Review. And I think that realism inevitably is going to have a resurgence in American politics for the simple reason that it reflects reality. Realism takes into account, it represents all the things that you explained, but it takes into account certain realities that humanitarians like to either ignore or forget or attack. The reality of human nature, the reality of cultural imperatives that exist in all peoples, the reality of national impulses. All of those are realities that realists try to take into account as they figure out how to proceed in terms of American foreign policy. And ultimately, they have to be taken into account because they can't be ignored. So I think there's going to be a resurgence at some point in what we like to think of as realism.
Well, on that optimistic note, I would like to thank you for the conversation, Bob.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.